Why Germans feared American infantry, but not British or other Allied troops. Part 1. The Amateur Professionals. By the summer of 1944, the German army was the most experienced fighting force on the planet. They had fought from the gates of Moscow to the sands of North Africa. They were masters of the book. They understood the British, who were disciplined, cautious, and fought with the precision of a clock. They understood the Soviets, who fought with a brutal, grinding mass. But when the Germans met the Americans in the hedgerows of Normandy, they were faced with something they didn't know how to categorize: an army of amateurs who fought like they were in a bar fight. German veterans would later write in their journals that the British would attack, and if they were stopped, they would dig in and wait for tea and a new plan. But the Americans? If you stopped an American squad, they didn't wait for a plan. They just got angry. The Germans began to realize that the American infantryman didn't follow the rules of war. He followed the rule of results. And that made him the most unpredictable and terrifying man on the battlefield. The unchecked initiative in the German army. Orders came from the top down. A lieutenant waited for a captain. A captain waited for a colonel. In the American army, initiative lived in the pockets of the sergeants. German officers were shocked to find that if they killed an American officer, the squad didn't stop. A 20-year-old corporal from Ohio would simply take over, grab a Thompson submachine gun, and keep moving forward. The Germans called this unregulated aggression. To a German commander, it looked like chaos. But to the man in the foxhole, it was a nightmare. You could never break an American unit by taking out its leaders, because every American soldier acted like he was the leader. They didn't wait for the perfect tactical moment. They created the moment through sheer, stubborn movement. The firepower paradox: the Germans had the best machine guns, the Muga 42. The Hitlers saw it could fire 1,200 rounds per minute. They expected the superior technology to terrify the Americans. Instead, the Americans used a different logic. They realized that they didn't need to fire faster if they could fire everything. German prisoners of war often complained that the Americans were unfair. They said that if a single German sniper fired a shot from a farmhouse, the Americans wouldn't send a squad to flush him out like the British would. Instead, the Americans would pick up a radio, and 5 minutes later, the entire farmhouse would be erased by 6 batteries of 105mm howitzers. The Germans feared the American infantry because the infantry was just the finger pointing the hand of God at them. The Americans treated artillery like a personal sniper rifle. They were wasteful with ammunition, but stingy with their own lives. The amateur advantage. Perhaps the biggest reason for the fear was the American background. The British were often career soldiers or city dwellers. But the American GI of 1944 was often a kid who had grown up during the Great Depression. He knew how to fix a tractor with a piece of wire. He knew how to hunt deer in the woods of Kentucky. He knew how to make do. When an American tank broke down, the crew didn't wait for a recovery vehicle. They used a blowtorch and scrap metal to fix it themselves. When they ran into a hedgerow they couldn't get through, they welded giant teeth onto the front of their tanks to rip the earth apart. The Germans, who relied on perfect engineering and strict discipline, found this MacGyver style of warfare impossible to predict. You can't outthink an enemy who doesn't know what he is going to do next until he does it. The psychological shadow. By the time the Allied forces reached the German border, the German soldiers had developed a saying: the British we can stop. The Russians we can slow down. But the Americans just keep coming until they run out of map. It wasn't that the Americans were better soldiers in a traditional sense. It was that they were relentless. They had an industrial engine behind them that provided infinite boots, infinite beans, and infinite bullets. The Germans feared the American infantryman because he was the face of a new world, a world where tradition and military class meant nothing, and aggression and output meant everything. The first verdict: the German fear wasn't based on a lack of respect. It was based on a clash of cultures. The Germans were the masters of the old way of war. The Americans were the pioneers of the total way of war. In the next chapter, we will look at the specific weapon that the Germans called the Black Death, not a bomb or a tank, but the American forward observer. The hunt for the truth continues. Part 2. The Hand of God. In the journals of German veterans who survived the Western Front, one figure appears more often than any other. It isn't the American paratrooper with his jump boots, or the tank commander in his Sherman. It is a lonely, mud-caked soldier sitting in a ruined church steeple, or crawling through a ditch with a heavy radio on his back. He was the forward observer. To the Germans, he was the most dangerous man in Europe. German doctrine taught that artillery was a support weapon, something you used to prepare for an attack. But the Americans turned artillery into their primary killing engine. They didn't use it to help the infantry. They used the infantry to find targets for the artillery. The German infantry soon realized a terrifying truth. If you fired a single machine gun at a British platoon, they would return fire with rifles. If you fired at an American platoon, the sky would fall on your head 5 minutes later. They called it the Hand of God, and it was the reason the German army, despite all its experience, lived in a state of constant, paralyzing fear. The math of destruction, the FDC, what the Germans didn't understand was the brain behind the guns. While the German and British armies relied on individual batteries of 4 guns to fire at specific spots, the Americans had perfected the Fire Direction Center, or the FDC. Every American radio operator was linked to a centralized hub. When a forward observer called in a target, he didn't just get 4 guns. He got every gun within range, sometimes dozens, sometimes hundreds. The Americans had turned the math of war into an assembly line. They used slide rules and specialized graphical firing tables to calculate wind, temperature, and even the rotation of the Earth in seconds. German prisoners often asked to see the automatic cannons the Americans were using. They couldn't believe that human beings could load and fire standard howitzers that fast. To the Germans, the speed of the American response felt like magic, a dark mechanical magic designed to erase them from the map. The time on target nightmare. But the true psychological horror was a tactic the Americans called time on target, or TOT. In a standard British or German barrage, you heard the first shell hit, and you had a few seconds to dive for cover before the rest arrived. It was a warning. The Americans found that warning unacceptable. Using their FDC math, they would coordinate batteries located at different distances from the target. The guns furthest away would fire first. A few seconds later, the closer guns would fire, then the closest guns. The result? 500 shells fired from 10 different locations would all arrive at the exact same spot at the exact same second. One moment, the forest was silent. The next moment, the entire world exploded. There was no whistle of incoming mail. There was no time to run. In one heartbeat, an entire German company could simply cease to exist. German veterans described it as the absolute end. It wasn't a battle. It was a deletion. The contrast, British precision versus American volume. The Germans respected the British artillery. They called it orderly. The British would fire a creeping barrage that moved in a predictable line. If you knew the pattern, you could survive. The British were stingy with their shells. They fired only what was necessary according to the plan. The Americans had no plan other than more. American logistics were so vast that they treated 105mm shells like they were rifle bullets. If a German sniper was suspected to be in a barn, the British would send a sniper to deal with him. The Americans would drop 40 tons of high explosives on the barn just to be sure. The Germans found this industrial wastefulness deeply demoralizing. It signaled to the German soldier that his skill, his camouflage, and his bravery didn't matter. You can't outbrawl a man who is throwing mountains at you. The forward observer, the invisible sniper, because the Germans feared the artillery so much, the forward observer became the most wanted man on the front. If a German unit spotted a soldier with a radio or binoculars, every sniper and machine gunner would open fire on him immediately. They knew that if that man spoke into his microphone, their position was doomed. But the Americans were clever. They began putting forward observers in Piper Cub airplanes, tiny, unarmored cloth planes that hovered over the battlefield like vultures. The Germans hated these grasshoppers. They were too slow to be hit by fast fighter planes and too small to be worth an anti-aircraft shell. But as long as that grasshopper was in the air, the German infantry felt naked. They knew that the hand of God was looking down at them, just waiting for a reason to point its finger. The verdict of the steel. By the end of 1944, the German fear of American infantry was inseparable from their fear of the artillery. The Germans realized that the American GI wasn't just a soldier, he was a sensor. He was a piece of a larger machine. He didn't have to be a better shot than the German. He just had to stay alive long enough to call for the guns. This created a psychological crumble. German soldiers began to feel that fighting the Americans was like fighting a factory. You could kill the workers, but the machines would just keep throwing steel at you. In the next chapter, we will look at the internal combustion war, why every American having a truck made the Germans feel like they were fighting an enemy from the future. The hand of God had spoken, and it spoke in the language of high explosives. Part 3. The Mechanical Beast. If you look at German propaganda films from 1944, you see a world of steel and gasoline. You see the massive Tiger tanks and the sleek jet fighters. But if you look at the reality of the German infantrymen, the Lanzer, the truth was much older. The German army that invaded France and the Soviet Union relied on nearly 3 million horses. To a German soldier, logistics meant a wooden cart, a bag of oats, and a tired animal. Then came the Americans. When the Germans first encountered the American army in bulk, they didn't see an army of men. They saw an army of wheels. To the German eye, it looked like every single American private had been issued his own engine. While the British were orderly and the Germans were traditional, the Americans were mobile. They didn't march. They drove. And in the eyes of a starving mud-caked German soldier, this mechanical superiority wasn't just an advantage, it was a terrifying sign that they were fighting a civilization from a different era. The icon of the New World, the Jeep. To the Germans, the most baffling and frightening vehicle in the American arsenal wasn't the Sherman tank. It was a small, open-topped box on 4 wheels called the Jeep. German veterans noted with a mix of jealousy and fear that the Jeep was everywhere. It was a scout vehicle. It was an ambulance. It was a mobile machine gun nest. It was a radio hub. In the German army, if a general wanted to move, he used a staff car. If a colonel wanted to move, he had a horse. In the American army, a lowly sergeant could hop into a Jeep and be 5 miles away in 10 minutes. The Jeep gave the American infantry a tactical fluidity that the Germans couldn't match. It meant that American units could scout deeper, react faster, and retreat or reinforce before the Germans could even get their horses harnessed. The Germans called it the leaping rat because it could go anywhere and was impossible to pin down. The Red Ball Express, the pulse of iron, but the mechanical beast wasn't just about scouting. It was about the pulse. After the breakout from Normandy, the Allied armies began to move faster than their supply lines could keep up. The solution was the Red Ball Express, a massive fleet of thousands of trucks, driven mostly by African American soldiers who worked in 24-hour shifts. The Germans were stunned. They watched from their hidden positions as a constant, never-ending stream of American deuce-and-a-half trucks sped down the roads with their headlights on, even at night. To a German commander, this was insane. It showed a total lack of fear. But more importantly, it showed abundance. The Red Ball Express delivered 600 tons of supplies every single day. While German soldiers were scavenging for potatoes in French fields and waiting days for a single crate of ammunition to arrive by horse cart, the American infantryman was getting fresh-bred hot coffee and more ammunition than he could ever fire. The Germans feared the American infantry because they realized they weren't just fighting men. They were fighting a factory on wheels that never slept. The psychological collapse of the horse army. There is a psychological toll to being outpaced. When a German unit was defeated, they had to retreat at the speed of a walking man or a tired horse. The Americans, however, could pursue them at 40 miles per hour. This meant that there was no safe zone for the Germans. Even if they broke contact and ran for 10 miles, an American armored infantry unit could be waiting for them at the next crossroads before they even arrived. German prisoners of war often described a feeling of dread whenever they heard the sound of a distant engine. In the East, the sound of a Soviet tank meant a brutal fight. In the West, the sound of an American engine meant that the entire world was moving faster than you could think. The Germans, who considered themselves the masters of blitzkrieg or lightning war, realized that they were now the ones being struck by the lightning. And the lightning was made of American rubber and gasoline. The maintenance miracle. The Germans also feared the American mechanical spirit. Because America was a nation of cars, almost every GI had grown up working on an engine. To a German soldier, a machine was a complex piece of state engineering that required a specialist to fix. To an American, a machine was something you fixed with a wrench and a piece of wire. German officers were horrified to see American crews repairing tanks and trucks right on the front lines, often using parts cannibalized from other wrecks. This mechanical intuition meant that American units stayed at full strength, while German units slowly bled to death because they couldn't fix a broken axle or a clogged fuel line. The American infantryman wasn't just a soldier. He was a mobile mechanic. He didn't respect the machine, he owned it. The verdict of the bumper. By the winter of 1944, the disparity was total. The German army was literally starving for oil, while American soldiers were using gasoline to clean their boots. The German soldier was walking through the snow, while the American was riding in the back of a heated transport. The Germans feared the American infantry because the Americans had defeated distance. They had turned the battlefield into a highway. In the final chapter, we will look at the total psychological collapse of the Reich, why in the end, the German soldier decided that it was better to surrender to the mechanical giants of the West than to face the masses of the East. The horse was dead, the engine was king, and the king was American. Part 4, The Final Verdict. By April of 1945, the thousand-year Reich was a smoking ruin. The German army, once the terror of Europe, was a broken collection of old men and terrified boys. To the east, the Soviet steamroller was screaming for blood and revenge. To the west, the American mechanical beast was simply arriving. The German Lanzer, the common infantryman, was caught in a psychological vice. But it was in these final desperate weeks that the American anomaly reached its peak. The Germans didn't fear the Americans the same way they feared the Soviets. They didn't even fear them the way they respected the British. They feared the Americans because the Americans were the only ones who had successfully turned war into a business of destruction. They realized that while the German soldier fought for glory and the Soviet soldier fought for hate, the American soldier fought to go home. And a man who wants to go home and has the entire industrial output of North America to help him do it is the most dangerous man on earth. The paradox of the preferred enemy in the final days. A strange saying began to circulate among the German ranks. Run to the west, crawl to the east. The Germans fought the Americans with a ferocity that baffled the Allied high command. They defended every bridge and every crossroad as if the war could still be won. But they weren't fighting to win. They were fighting for time. They were fighting to hold the line just long enough so that their families, their wounded, and their entire units could escape the Soviet advance and reach the American lines. The Germans feared the American infantry in combat, but they trusted them in defeat. They knew that if they surrendered to the British, they would be treated with stiff-necked discipline. If they surrendered to the Soviets, they would disappear into the gulags. But if they surrendered to the Americans, they would get a hot meal, a Lucky Strike cigarette, and a chance to survive. This was the ultimate psychological victory. The Americans had conquered the German spirit, not just with high explosives, but with decency and abundance. The insurance company with tanks, one German lieutenant, after being captured in the Ruhr pocket, famously said that fighting the Americans felt like trying to sue an insurance company. He explained that when you fought the British, it was a game of chess. When you fought the Soviets, it was a knife fight in a dark room. But when you fought the Americans, it was like a massive impersonal machine was simply closing your account. The Americans wouldn't engage in heroic bayonet charges or romanticized duels. If a German position was too strong, the Americans would simply back away, call in 200 bombers, and wait. They treated German lives like a math problem that needed to be solved with the least amount of American overhead. This impersonal warfare was what truly broke the German veteran. It made them feel small. It made their martial heritage feel obsolete. The Americans proved that, in the 20th century, a brave man with a bolt-action rifle is no match for a bored man with a radio and 1,000 tons of steel. The chocolate and the cigarette, the final blow to the German psyche, wasn't the bomb. It was the American logistics of luxury. German soldiers were starving, wearing rags, and using wooden carts. When they were captured, they were stunned to find that every American infantryman had high-quality boots, waterproof jackets, and a pocket full of chocolate, chewing gum, and cigarettes. One German colonel remarked that he knew the war was lost when he saw an American transport ship carrying nothing but fresh ice cream for the troops. "We are fighting for our lives," he said, "and they are fighting with ice cream." How can you defeat a nation that treats war like a summer vacation? The American GI's ability to remain human, to joke, to complain about the food, and to hand out candy to German children even while they were destroying the German army was the most terrifying anomaly of all. It showed a level of confidence that the Germans could never achieve. The legacy of the anomaly when the guns finally went silent in May of 1945. The German fear of the American infantry transformed into something else: observation. The German veterans who went on to form the new West German Army, the Bundeswehr, didn't look to the British or the Soviets for their new model. They looked to the Americans. They adopted the American sergeant-led initiative. They adopted the American mobile logic. They realized that the amateurs from Ohio and Texas had actually been the most professional soldiers of all, because they had mastered the total integration of man, machine, and mind. The American infantryman was feared not because he was a war lover, but because he was a war solver. He did the job, he paid the price in steel instead of blood whenever possible, and then he went home to build a new world. The final verdict, the American anomaly, was the realization that order is not as strong as adaptability. The Germans had the order. The British had the tradition. The Soviets had the mass. But the Americans had the will to innovate. They were the army of the ordinary man, doing extraordinary things with an infinite supply. And that is why, in the dark woods of the Ardennes and the muddy fields of the Rhineland, the German soldier looked toward the west and saw not just an enemy, but the future. The Reaper had a shovel, but the American GI had the world. And the world was more than enough. Part 5. The Immortal Army. By the winter of 1944, the German Lanzer was a master of the art of dying. He had seen his comrades fall in the thousands across the frozen wastes of Russia. He knew that in the German army, a serious wound was a death sentence. If you were hit, you waited for a horse cart that might never come, to be taken to a field hospital that had no medicine. But when the Germans fought the American infantry, they encountered a phenomenon that broke their understanding of warfare. They called it the Immortal Army. The Germans realized that for every American soldier they wounded, there was a specialized system designed to snatch that man back from the gates of hell. They saw men in the middle of a firefight, wearing white circles with red crosses on their helmets, running into a hail of machine gun fire, not to kill, but to save. This wasn't just first aid. It was the industrialization of mercy. And to a German soldier who felt like cannon fodder, seeing an enemy that valued every individual life enough to build a global chain of survival was the ultimate psychological defeat. The doc, the ghost of the front line in the German and British armies, medical personnel were often kept in the rear. But the Americans did something radical. They put the doc, the combat medic, directly into the infantry squad. German veterans described their amazement at seeing these unarmed Americans. The doc didn't carry a rifle. He carried 2 heavy bags filled with morphine, sulfa powder, and bandages. He was a 19-year-old kid who had more authority over his squad than the sergeant when it came to life and death. The Germans feared the American infantry because the presence of the medic created a fearless aggression. An American I knew that if he was hit, someone would be screaming medic before he even hit the ground. He knew that help was seconds away. To the German soldier, who was often told to sacrifice himself for the fatherland, fighting an enemy that refused to let its men stay dead was demoralizing. It made the German effort feel useless. You could shoot an American, but 3 weeks later, that same man would be back on the line with a fresh uniform and a new rifle. The miracle of plasma and sulfa. The Germans were stunned by the science in the American foxhole. While German soldiers were still using primitive dressings and hoping to avoid infection, every American carried a first aid packet with sulfa powder, the world's first miracle antibiotic. But the real terror for the Germans was blood plasma. The Americans were the first to move the blood bank to the front line. German prisoners often spoke with wide eyes about seeing American medics hanging glass bottles from rifle barrels stuck in the dirt, pumping life-saving fluid into men who should have been dead from shock. One German doctor, captured in Normandy, remarked that the Americans don't win battles with better strategy. They win because they can afford to keep their men alive. The German infantryman felt like he was fighting a revolving door. No matter how many Americans he hit, the line never seemed to get thinner. The golden hour and the sky hospitals, the Germans also feared the American speed. They noticed that the Americans had perfected the golden hour, the idea that if you can get a wounded man into surgery within 60 minutes, he will live. The American infantry was backed by a fleet of jeeps converted into ambulances and, most incredibly, medical evacuation planes. The Germans watched from their trenches as C-47 transport planes landed in muddy fields, loaded hundreds of wounded men, and flew them to state-of-the-art hospitals in England. To a German soldier who had to endure a 3-day journey in a cold train car to reach a hospital, this was like science fiction. It reinforced the idea that the Americans were fighting with the future on their side. The Immortal Army wasn't just a nickname, it was a reality of logistics. The American infantry was the only force in the war that actually grew more experienced as it fought, because so many of its veterans survived their wounds to fight again. The psychological shield. This medical superiority created a psychological shield for the American GI. It allowed him to take risks that a German soldier wouldn't dream of. When an American commander ordered a charge across an open field, his men went forward because they trusted the doc. They trusted the system. They knew that the entire weight of the United States government was committed to bringing them home, even if it was on a stretcher. The Germans, on the other hand, felt abandoned. By 1945, German soldiers were being told that their wounds were a badge of honor for the Führer, which was cold comfort when you were bleeding out in a ditch. The fear of the American infantry was in many ways a fear of American compassion. The Germans realized that a nation that cares this much for its own people is a nation that can never be truly broken. The verdict of the heart, the American anomaly, was the discovery that mercy is a force multiplier. The Germans had the will to kill, the Americans had the will to save. And in a war of attrition, the side that can save its soldiers is the side that eventually wins. German veterans would go home and tell stories not of the American tanks, but of the American medics. They would speak of the men who walked into fire with nothing but a red cross and a bag of bandages, and they would speak of them with a respect that bordered on awe. The American I was a warrior, But he was a warrior who traveled with a guardian angel, and you can't defeat an angel with a Mauser rifle. Part 6. The Rifleman's Creed. In the German military tradition, a sniper was a specialist. He was a man who attended a specific school, wore specific camouflage, and carried a specific weapon with a high-powered scope. To the Germans, if a man didn't have a scope, he wasn't a marksman. He was just infantry. But when the German Lanzer looked across the lines at the Americans, they realized they were facing a different kind of predator. They began to report something baffling. American privates, armed with nothing but standard iron sights, were making shots that the German manual said were impossible. They were hitting moving targets at 300 yards. They were picking off machine gunners through narrow slits in concrete bunkers. The Germans soon learned a painful lesson. In the American army, there was no such thing as just infantry. Every man was a rifleman. The Americans didn't just bring an army to Europe. They brought a hunting culture. And to a German soldier used to the rigid by-the-book training of the Wehrmacht, this instinctive, deadly precision was a terrifying anomaly. The Garand factor. 8 rounds of purgatory. The primary reason for this fear was a piece of wood and steel called the Mo1 Garand. To the German soldier, the Garand was a devil gun. The standard German rifle was the Mauser Co-98K, a bolt-action weapon that was essentially the same design used in the First World War. It held 5 rounds. Every time a German soldier fired, he had to manually move a bolt to chamber the next round, taking his eye off the target and losing his aim. The American GI, however, had 8 rounds of semi-automatic power. He didn't have to move a bolt. He just pulled the trigger. German veterans described this psychological weight of the Garand. They said that if you fired at American and missed, he didn't duck. He fired back 8 times before you could even reload your first shot. The volume of precision was overwhelming. The Americans could suppress a German machine gun nest with 3 riflemen because they could put so much accurate lead into a small space so quickly. The Germans feared the American infantry because the Garand turned every amateur into a rapid-fire marksman. The frontier heritage. Aim small, miss small. But the weapon was only half the story. The other half was the man holding it. While the British infantry was largely drawn from urban centers and industrial cities, a huge percentage of the American greatest generation had grown up in the rural South, the Midwest, and the West during the Great Depression. These were boys who had been hunting squirrels, rabbits, and deer since they were 10 years old. They weren't taught to shoot by a drill sergeant. They were taught to shoot by their fathers, who told them that if they wasted a bullet, they didn't eat that night. To these American kids, marksmanship wasn't a military skill, it was a survival skill. German officers noted with frustration that the Americans had an uncanny ability to use the terrain. They understood windage and elevation instinctively. They didn't wait for a sniper to deal with a German officer. The nearest American private would simply rest his rifle on a fence post and take the shot himself. The Germans feared the Americans because they weren't fighting soldiers. They were fighting hunters, the counter-sniper mentality. Aggressive scouting in most armies. If a sniper opened fire, the infantry would go to ground and wait for their own sniper to arrive. This was the professional way to handle it. The Americans, however, were aggressive. If a German sniper fired on an American squad, the Americans didn't just hide. They used what they called base of fire tactics. Half the squad would open up with Garands and bars, literally shaving the leaves off the trees where they thought the sniper was, while the other half of the squad would sprint forward to flank him. The Germans found this disregard for the sniper's power deeply unsettling. They realized that the Americans treated the German sniper not as a ghost to be feared, but as a target to be eliminated. American infantrymen would often engage in scouting by fire, shooting at every suspicious bush or window just to see if someone jumped. In a German army that was running out of ammunition, this profligate use of bullets to find one man was the ultimate sign of American dominance. The Scout-Sniper fusion. The I&R platoon by 1945 the Americans had perfected the intelligence and reconnaissance I&R platoon. These were small, elite groups of infantrymen who were experts in scouting and long-range shooting. The Germans began to fear these units more than the tanks. These men were shadows. They would slip behind German lines, watch a command post for 2 days, and then, with a few well-placed shots, kill the commanding officers and disappear into the woods before the Germans could even fire back. This created a state of paranoia. German officers began to strip their rank insignia off their uniforms and wear common soldier tunics because they knew that an American marksman was always watching. The Americans had turned the sniper's war into an infantry war. They had democratized the ability to kill from a distance. The verdict of the eye. The American anomaly was the realization that quantity and quality could exist in the same rifle. The Germans had a few elite marksmen who were world-class. The Americans had millions of good enough marksmen who were deadly. When the war ended, German veterans remembered the American infantryman as a man who was always looking. A man who didn't just spray and pray, but a man who took a breath, squeezed the trigger, and moved on. The Germans feared the American infantry because they realized that in the New World, every citizen was a rifleman. And every rifleman was a threat. The hunt was over, but the lesson remained. You can hide from a specialist, but you can't hide from an entire nation of hunters.